Hello and welcome to Scotland at 7 with me, Leslie Orr. I'm very pleased to be here and I'm delighted to introduce our two guests this evening. We have Kirsten Rummery, who is the Professor of Social Policy at Stirling University, and she's also a member of the Women's Equality Party, and Suzanne McLaughlin. Suzanne is one of the prospective SNP candidates for the Glasgow Kelvin constituency for next year's Scottish elections. And later on, we're going to be talking about misogyny and harassment and abuse of women in politics and more generally perhaps in public life in Scotland, in the media, in online and more generally in our political life and all the spaces where women are seeking to make themselves heard. But we're going to begin with the coronavirus update for today. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 933,195 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 879,179 were confirmed negative, 54,016 were positive, and there were 1,401 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There are 18 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive today. This will be an underestimate of the number of cases. Not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. Of the people who tested positive, 975 were in hospital last night, 76 of whom were in intensive care. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,688. This number only includes those who died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show 44,571 patients who tested positive for COVID have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 224 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. Linda, I can't hear you. Okay. Thank you. Today, the Scottish Government has announced a 5-level framework which will allow for a refreshed strategic approach to suppressing coronavirus outbreaks across Scotland. The framework indicates different levels of protection that might be needed based on different levels of transmission for the virus. It will allow for rapid but proportionate responses on both a local and national basis using a transparent range of measures and options. The framework will comprise 5 protection levels. Level 0 is effectively the same level of protection as the route map Phase 3 measures Scotland reached in August and will act as a baseline, with 4 levels above that designed to apply increasing protection from the virus in areas according to prevalence, according to the risk to communities and the need to protect the NHS. Levels 1, 2 and 3 will be broadly equivalent to the UK government levels to offer some uniformity with measures south of the border. Levels will be reviewed on a regular basis. Ongoing financial support is set out in the framework and will be available to businesses which are required to close or which can remain open but will be directly affected by restrictions. The Scottish Government will work with local authorities to ensure grants are made available quickly and efficiently. Further details in which local authority areas of Scotland will fall under which levels will be announced following discussions with directors of public health and local authorities, taking on board recommendations from the National Incident Management Team before coming into force on the 2nd of November. The announcement of the new Scottish framework comes as Wales is about to go into its firebreak lockdown and Manchester enters England's Tier 3 restrictions. NHS National Services Scotland is helping to set up a 3 new regional laboratory hubs which will support a sustainable approach to COVID-19 testing in Scotland. The 3 hubs, which will deliver more than 22,000 additional tests per day for NHS Scotland, will go live over a phased opening between mid-November and December. The hubs will be located in the following sites, which were previously occupied by the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service: Gartnavel Hospital in Glasgow, Lauriston Place, Edinburgh, and Forester Hill, Aberdeen. COVID-19 testing turnaround times and capacity must be the Scottish Government's priority, according to a review of the testing strategy. The review has advised that routine testing should also be expanded to protect those at high risk, and highlights that Scotland is on track to increase overall testing capacity to 65,000 tests per day by winter. The clinical and scientific review has been published by the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Nursing Officer, the National Clinical Director, Chief Scientific Advisor and Chief Scientist for Health, and comes ahead of the publication of the Strategic Framework for Suppressing the Virus. The 3 new regional laboratory hubs will be used in the first instance to process care home staff testing and to provide capacity and resilience to health boards through the winter and beyond. The SNP has said that Boris Johnson must U-turn on his cruel decision to cut free school meals funding across the UK, as local businesses and communities across England volunteer to feed children left without by the Tory government. Neil Gray MP said the outpouring of generosity in response to Marcus Rashford's campaign was truly inspiring, but also hugely embarrassing for the Prime Minister that local communities have had to step in due to Tory cuts. The SNP Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary said it was shameful that Scottish Tory MPs had voted to oppose free school meals and cut Scotland's budget by millions of pounds. He challenged Douglas Ross to back SNP calls for a U-turn. While the SNP government has announced a £10 million package of funding to continue free school meals over the coming holidays in Scotland, and this policy has been funded from existing budgets after the Tory government cut off Barnett consequentials for the policy. The Scottish Greens have launched an ambitious new deal for workers, calling for more powers for trade unions to tackle low pay, precarious contacts and poor working conditions. The Scottish Green New Deal for workers includes proposals to establish national collective bargaining to drive up pay and conditions in low-wage sectors, for example, social care and early years education. The proposals would require companies who receive public grants to recognise trade unions, eliminate precarious contracts, and pay at least the real living wage. The report recognises policies that are reserved to the UK Parliament and would need to be implemented at that level, unless Scotland gains independence or the necessary powers are devolved.
Yeah, it does actually.
These include raising the minimum wage and statutory sick pay and working towards a 4-day week at full pay. Protests are banned for various Polish cities this weekend amid public anger over a ruling which will ban almost all abortion in the country. Poland already has some of the most draconian abortion laws in Europe. And yesterday, a constitutional tribunal ruled that one of the few exceptions to the ban, cases of severe fetal impairment, should also
you just know it's done, you know.
These cases, which hardline Catholic anti-abortion activists have called eugenic abortion, made up almost all of the small number of abortions performed legally in Poland. The Constitutional Tribunal found that abortion in cases where there is a high probability of severe and irreversible fetal impairment or an incurable life-threatening disease is a violation of the constitutional right to life. The country's populist, socially conservative law and justice government, which has been accused of eroding judicial independence, has packed the tribunal with loyalists. Despite a ban on gatherings, there are a number of protests planned for Friday evening and the weekend, with many emphasising that they would observe distancing measures. On Thursday evening, protesters in Warsaw gathered outside the home of Jarosław Kaczynski, the powerful deputy prime minister. Police used pepper spray against the protesters and detained 15 people. US President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden offered sharply contrasting views of the still raging coronavirus pandemic at last night's final presidential debate, seeking to persuade the few remaining undecided voters with only 12 days remaining before the contest on November the 3rd. Trump was more restrained than he was during a chaotic first debate in September, when he repeatedly interrupted Biden. But there were still plenty of personal attacks from two men who show little respect for each other. And Trump kept fact-checkers busy by levelling unfounded corruption accusations at Biden and his family. The absence of disruptions yielded a more substantive debate over a range of topics, including the economy, race, climate change, healthcare and immigration. But the coronavirus, which has killed more than 221,000 people in the United States, loomed over the proceedings as it has throughout the campaign. The encounter in Nashville, Tennessee was one of Trump's last remaining opportunities to reshape the presidential race. National opinion polls show he has been losing for months, though the contest is much tighter in some battleground states, which are likely to decide the election. Details of grants available to businesses as part of Scotland's refreshed strategic approach to suppressing coronavirus have been published. From the 2nd of November, firms that are required by law to close will be eligible for grants every 4 weeks for as long as the restrictions last. Based on rateable values, awards will be for either £2,000 or £3,000. Businesses which can remain open but are directly constrained by the measures will be eligible for grants worth £1,400 or £2,100, again based on rateable value. This support is in addition to the UK government's revised furlough scheme launching on the 1st of November. And now we're going to spend the rest of the programme looking at the very serious current issue of the abuse and harassment of women in politics, online, and in the print media. You know, I remember when the Scottish Parliament first came along in 1999, we really thought that this was going to be a great new dawn of progressive government, inclusive, representative, and involving women. Lots of women. A real challenge to the age-old macho culture of politics and public life in Scotland. And it was great then to see nearly 40% of the MSPs voted in were women. But since then, I wonder how much things have changed. Recently, Nicola Sturgeon called out Cybernat misogyny, and she did say that she thought perhaps she might not have come into politics if the situation had been as it is now for those who are planning to stand in political life or get engaged in different ways. So this is a really big concern, and I think it's a very timely conversation for us to be having. I want to turn first of all to Suzanne. And Suzanne, you're somebody who has been involved in Scottish politics in different ways over recent years.
Absolutely.
I know that you've had some very negative and concerning experiences. It'd be good if you could just start the ball rolling by telling us a little bit about what that has been and how it has impacted on you.
Well, there's the mundane and everyday sexism, Leslie, that you sort of come to get really very used to as a woman in public life in any way, never mind trying to get elected. What I find a little bit most distressing is I was actually on Broadcasting Scotland 4 years ago discussing misogyny towards women and young women in politics and in public life. And it feels as if not only are we no further forward, but things actually might be a little bit worse than they were then. Just in the last couple of weeks, I found myself brought into a massive pile-on in Twitter through no fault of my own. And it was quite a powerful man who started it, and he pled ignorance to his behaviours. But even when it became obvious that his followers were being quite sexually abusive to me as well, he left the post up. It was, of course, Alec Massey of The Spectator who had a picture of myself, and which showed my name. I was featured in a newspaper. Now, it happens to be it was a Sunday National, which most viewers will watch know my partner's the editor of, and the newspaper had taken a decision to feature as many women standing for and men, some men as well, but largely women who were standing for selection to be elected in this current crop of people trying to be selected for Holyrood candidacy next year. So the newspaper has featured almost 30 candidates, including high-profile men like Angus Robertson, Marco Biaggi, Antonio Giuliano, and lots of women, and including even one of the women I'm in a contest with. So the newspaper has been very fair, but the Sunday National is a paper that's out for independence, says so, and was featuring these candidates. Now, Alec Massey, of course, is a prominent columnist of The Spectator, and his comments were really unpleasant and directed towards my partner, but said, is this just for the person who goes out with the editor? So what you found there is two men. Alec Massey later went on to say it was about journalism and journalistic integrity. But of course, what happened was no one in the almost 200 comments that followed, no one criticised Alec Massey or indeed my partner. They all criticised me, and messages such as sleeping my way into the paper, sleeping my way into politics, comments on my appearance, calling me fat, useless, stupid, bringing my business into it, talking about my opinions on women's right to choose, and it just went on and on and on. I got direct messages from men. Now, this is just one example in one day on Twitter. Now, at the moment with coronavirus, a lot of women who are trying to enter politics feel there's no choice but to engage in political discussions on Twitter or Facebook. So we do have to be there. And it is almost impossible to inure yourself against the horribleness, quite frankly. It feels relentless. And what I most worry about is I'm in a fairly secure position. I'm 51 years old. I do have an editor partner. I am quite high profile. I'm very lucky to have some of Scotland's best feminists on side. Some high profile politicians stepped in to defend me. But somewhere there is a young woman, maybe doing politics or with an interest in politics, sitting alone in her house or her room, or student digs, looking at the way I was treated and thinking again. And that's what's really depressing about all of this.
Yeah. Thanks, Suzanne. Kirsten, you're also involved in a political party and put yourself in the front line online and in other spaces. I wonder if that kind of chimes with the sorts of experiences that you've had, and more generally, what's the research evidence? What's the data that backs up the kind of claims that Suzanne's making there?
Yeah, as you introduced me there, I've got kind of two hats on. I've got an academic feminist hat on, and also as a founding member of the Women's Equality Party. And so I've got a public face with both of those hats on. And it's interesting the different kinds of abuse that I get with those hats on. But the thing that unites that is it's abuse against me because I'm a woman. And it's abuse, and it's highly sexualized, and it's highly violent in a way that is never, ever directed towards my male colleagues, either in politics or in academia. I really noticed this a couple of years ago. So the 2017 general elections, I ran for parliament. And so for the first time, put my head above the parapet as a politician. Weirdly, the kind of abuse I got was actually not as nasty as the abuse that I get for being an academic feminist online. And what is actually worrying about the kind of abuse that I and lots of other women who are academic feminists is that it doesn't stay online. That often people will target you because you've got opinions they don't like, whether that's on a particular issue or you've said something or you look in a way that they don't like. I think the general thing that unites is you are a woman with opinions, airing those in a public sphere that a certain group of people, usually men, find just unacceptable that you're even there, let alone that you're actually saying anything. So they didn't just target me. When they realized that I was going to shut them down and not listen to them, they started stalking and harassing my students, my colleagues, my friends, people I'd worked with in the third sector, trying to find email addresses for people. And of course, they hadn't said the thing that or whatever it was that had provoked that kind of anger. They had no idea what it was. But they knew that it was a personal attack against me, but also that somebody had gone to the trouble, several people had gone to the trouble to find out people's email addresses, to find out their home addresses, to find out where they lived. So this isn't just a problem online, it transfers into real life as well. And actually, as a member of a political party, I was much more protected from that than I was as just an academic, because the Women's Equality Party itself is set up as a feminist party, and we knew when we set ourselves up that we were going to be targeted like this. And certainly during the 2017 general election, I got some abuse, but I didn't get nearly as much abuse as women of colour who were running, who were getting both sexist and racist abuse. And all of it was unmitigatingly violent threats, sexualized threats, horrible things, not just insults and personal digs and things, but, we're going to stalk you, we're going to find you, we're going to set fire to you, we're going to burn you, we're going to find your children, all of those. And they're absolutely horrendous, particularly as women, when it starts to kind of filter out and start affecting our families. I think at that point, a lot of us would draw a line in the sand and say, this just isn't worth it. And it was one of the reasons I thought, well, in terms of political activism, I'm not standing for election again, personally. It just wasn't worth the hassle and abuse that I and my family got. There's a lot of research that backs up what Suzanne is really, really worried about, that it's not just us in the front line who are getting the abuse, but it's the people watching the abuse. Particularly young women of colour, people of colour, but women generally who watch what happens to people like me. And what happens to people like me is kind of fairly low key. Look at what's happening to people like Nicola Sturgeon. Look at what's happening to people like Diane Abbott, who, gets thousands and thousands of threats via Twitter and via social media every day and has to have police protection in some cases about it. And let's not forget that, we've had a political assassination of a woman, Jo Cox, who was stalked online, and it turned into a real thing. So this isn't just words. It can actually translate into real, actual, tangible threats against women. And the way it is done to women is done in a sexualized, violent way, in a way that all people who put themselves out there will get abuse, will get kinds of sometimes threatening messages, that kind of thing. But if you're part of a political party, and I found this as well, you do have a certain level of protection. But the rest of women who are in public life don't even have the protection of a political party. They may have expressed an opinion as part of a third sector organization or as part of their daily work or even just as an individual. And they'll get the similar level of abuse and harassment. And it is sexualized and it is directed at us as women because we are women. It doesn't seem to matter what it is that we say politically, because that's not the target of the abuse. The target of the abuse is us personally. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that A, this puts women off going into public life generally. B, it really, really puts women off going into politics generally. And you talked, Leslie, there, we started out in 1999 with a 40% of women MSPs. That's now gone down to just under a third. And it's staying roughly level, but there's lots of kind of ingrained reasons why there's not equal numbers of women MSPs. There's nowhere near equal numbers of women MPs. There's nowhere near equal numbers of women councillors in local authorities. And it's not just because they're really scared of facing that kind of abuse. But that is a huge part of it. And because social media plays such a huge part in our lives now anyway, because everything is online, we don't have a different scenario in which we can go out. People will say things to you on social media that they wouldn't dream of saying in public, apart from anything else, because it would be illegal. It'd be threatening behavior and they'd get arrested for it. But they can hide behind Twitter handles. They can hide anonymously in Facebook groups, and they can dox you. They can find out your personal details, and they can dox your family and friends. And there is very little to do that you can actually do as an individual to stop this happening.
Yeah. This is absolutely a crisis for our democracy, isn't it? Because this is women being constrained and being scared off and being told that they're alien invaders into the realm of public and political life. How are we going to respond to this, and where do we build women's resilience, and how do we support them? Suzanne, what's your experience? I mean, you're willing to put yourself through this fire in the months ahead. Where do you get your support from?
You mostly, and Kristen, and women like you. I think there is not so much that there is support, although it is there from other women. We quietly message each other. I'm very supported by a couple of older feminists who message me regularly, and I'm very supported by two young in my party, both of them have received the most shocking abuse, far more than I ever have. I'm talking, of course, about Rosa Zampanini, a young woman who has decided to step away from politics. A fantastic young woman, but Rosa doesn't look the way people want these abusive men, let's call it what it is, want their politicians to look. She's fun, she's pretty, she likes fashion, she has a laugh, she has selfies, as if somehow that negates her intelligence and her care for people in her community. Bullied horrendously and relentlessly when she was a councillor, and as I say, has now stepped away from public life, but she remains a support to women who are involved in public life. And of course, I look to another young woman who has received so much abuse online that she's had to have some police advice, and her friends look out for her, of course, is Rhiannon Spear, who's a candidate for Argyll and Bute, for a prospective candidate for the SNP up there. I have never seen a young woman so badly treated in such a long time. I think what we have to do is, women can't change. We mustn't change. All three of myself, Rhiannon and Rosa, all have young daughters. This can't be their fight. My mum and her friends thought it was their fight, and so that I wouldn't have to do that. I wouldn't have to go through this. So this can't be my daughter's fight. It can't be Rhiannon and Rosa's fight. I don't know how we fix it, but it's. I think what we have to remember is, as you're correctly pointing out, Leslie, who wins when women step away? Men. So it's time that men stood up, even when they're not the ones. Men have to challenge each other. Men have to change. They have to get better. They have to call each other out. They have to rip down the structures that keep us trapped in this horrible culture of toxic and hegemonic masculinity.
Yep, all of that is absolutely right. And of course, the thing that we all have in common is that we're members of Women for Independence. And this has been one of the fundamental reasons why Women for Independence actually exists. It's to support and to encourage and to enable young women and women of any age and across the board in all our diversity, to get involved in politics, because we know that when women are around the table, it really makes a difference to the kinds of issues that are discussed and the priorities for policy and for government. And in fact, I think this was one of the benefits and the outcomes of that first wave of women becoming MSPs, that we actually got violence against women onto the agenda as a priority and as a real concern for just the general quality and safety of all of us and of our public life in Scotland. So I'm just kind of thinking, do we have to take a bigger picture here? We have our Equally Safe strategy, which is to address violence against women and girls in Scotland. What else needs to happen? Kirsten, what are the actual, what are the steps? What do we need to be doing to nail this and to really tackle and challenge the misogyny, the hatred, this policing of women's space, because we know that it's not just something that happens in public life, it's across all domains of our life, in the home, in education, in the workplace. So I suppose I'm asking a kind of general question here, but more particularly, is there legislation, are there policies that we should be devising and introducing to tackle this particular concern about misogynistic abuse and harassment?
I would echo what Suzanne said about that it's actually up to men to fix this, because it's men who are causing it and men who are the problem. And you've asked about kind of solutions, and I don't, even though, there's a tremendous amount of resilient support for women backing up other women, and you can see it on social media. As soon as a pylon happens, there will be sisters from across different political parties, from across different political perspectives, calling it out. That's the first important thing, and making clear that it's not acceptable. That's the second important thing. And then supporting the women who are the victims of this, so that they don't get to the stage where they feel like they really have to step back from public life. Because as you said, the getting women into policy making quite clearly results in better outcomes and better policies that affect people's lives in ways that actually will reach far, far further and far more effectively. And it's not just women's lives, but it's also areas where women are particularly strong around family, community, education, health and social care services. Those things will become priorities because the women that work in them and the women that know about them will make them priorities. In terms of what we need to do, I think there's something about recognizing that this kind of abuse, the abuse that's happening online, the abuse that's happening through social media, is just as damaging as abuse that might be happening through written media. You can't libel people in written media. You can't do certain things. There are, quite effective laws against that. So we do need laws and policies that say you cannot attack people, you cannot threaten people. We will have a zero tolerance approach, just as we have zero tolerance approach to physical violence against women and girls. We have to have a zero tolerance approach to psychological violence against women and girls, because this is exactly what this is. And the Scottish Government has, been wonderfully progressive in recognizing. One of the most recent brilliant bits of legislation has been the recognition that psychological abuse is an important component of domestic abuse that women fear and experience every day. So we need to translate that into online. Now, that is very technically difficult because, of course, Twitter isn't just part of Scotland, it's an international arena, and so are other online places where this happens. So there needs to be a calling to account of men calling other men out, because that's where we get change. We can shout as much as we like as women, and we can change things as much as we like for other women. But until our male allies actually step up and not just say to people like Alex Massey, that's a bit out of order, but actually pointing out why it's out of order and saying why they don't support that kind of abuse. And there's all sorts of sexism that is, not even about abuse, but sort of calling out people for being partners of other people, calling out people's personal lives, calling out sexual preferences, calling out all sorts of things. Again, that disproportionately affects women in public life. And that needs to be part of the conversation, because if we accept that, to borrow again on Manic Street Preachers, then your children will be next, because it's the small bits of sexism, and we accept those, and then that adds up to bigger bits of sexism, and then we just tolerate those and accept those. So it really is up to, fantastic people like Suzanne's partners, people who have men who are powerful men who have positions in the media who other men will respect and listen to. And it's particularly when you look at and it's not just cyber nats, there are cyber yuns as well. I discovered this because I knew I was being equally offensive to both sides during the 2014 referendum, because both of them piled on me. So I thought, okay, as an academic, I've probably got the balance about right. I'm equally hated by both sides. But the difference, of course, is that they're not attacking like they would perhaps attack a male politician or a male academic for their views or their what they've written. They're attacking me personally because I'm a woman. Mm-hmm. And they'll either pick on you because you're too old or too young or too fat or too white or too coloured or whatever it is, and it'll be some way to diminish you. There has to be a zero tolerance to all of that. We have to up the game in public life about the kinds of things that we are prepared to tolerate and just say, no, this is not acceptable. And one of the wonderful, it was quite dispiriting when we had the kind of #MeToo movement to see the thousands and millions of women who came forward and shared their stories. But what that did was it highlighted and empowered not just other women, but men to say, actually, no, this is not acceptable anymore. And we kind of need to harness that, particularly amongst men in public spaces, that they do not tolerate abuse of their either of their colleagues, but also of their political opponents. I think that's also really, really important. It's not a partisan issue. Mm-hmm. If the three of us women here are very pro-independence, but we need to call it out when it happens to women who are not pro-independence. We need to call it out when it happens to women who are not in our political party. We need to call it out when it happens to women who we perhaps might not politically agree with at all. But we need to support each other. And we already do that as sisters. What we need is for the brothers to come in and start supporting us as well. And then we might stand a chance of actually seeing some real change.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, of course, Kirsten. And there are some good men out there, but they're few and far between. And we really need to step up here. Suzanne, I'm just wondering about, Kirsten's put that into the broader perspective and the picture, and that we really need some very fundamental cultural change in Scotland and changes to our understanding and practice of masculinity. This is about men's power, and it's about men wanting to keep women in their place and out of positions of power. But more particularly in relation to this kind of online misogyny and abuse. There is some discussion just now. There are proposals, of course, about hate crime legislation and whether there should be a gender aggravation for that legislation. But women's organisations and feminist organisations like Engender and Scottish Women's Aid are calling for a standalone offence. Do you think that would make any difference? Do you think that would help? Do you think it would help to drive the cultural change that we're looking for?
Yeah, I do actually. I think actually societal change is sometimes easier than we imagine it will be. I know that sounds absolutely crazy, and it's of course it's small potatoes. It's not men's endemic violence against women in all ways, and that's a big potato we're trying to peel there. But if you look, for example, we live in the West in Scotland here. This is being filmed in the West of Scotland. The show's going out all over Scotland, of course. But you take back just a few years ago when the Scottish Government first proposed a smoking ban in pubs. And like I say, I know it's a small issue, but everyone was going crazy. It won't happen. Everyone will break the law. There'll be public demonstrations in the streets. People will smoke because everyone had always smoked in restaurants, in their homes, their cars, around their children, and there was fury. People shouting they won't behave this rule, and really kind of within a day or 2 days, everyone just obeyed the law, and everyone started to realise actually restaurants and bars and cafes are a lot nicer without the smell of smoke. And now even smokers realise that this was the right thing. So the right kind of law, the right kind of framework, with the right message and the right people behind it, I think we can cause a societal shift in how things are happening. But we do have to get away from the fact that women are less than, and until the men, and we're in Scotland just now, so let's men in Scotland, you know, we have to take away from this situation that women are less than, and a lot of men, it's so endemic, these behaviours and this toxic masculinity, that men don't even realise they're doing it. It is the norm to them, and that's what, when something becomes the norm, it is seen as deviant to feel different, and people start to attack it. So we have to create a complete sea change. Now, what you're saying is absolutely right, Christine, about calling out people you disagree. The two young women I mentioned, we have disagreed hotly on many subjects. They're both very young feminists. They take a different view to quite a few issues from myself. But I just don't see the same type of toxic behaviour between women who disagree online and men disagreeing with women. We tend to disagree quite in most cases, and can still have each other's back. A few quite well-known Labour women have jumped in to defend me, Monica Lennon, Jackie Bailey. There does seem to be that bit of that cross divide. Now there is a very well-known Scottish feminist who did a study about 4 years ago. She keeps it a bit under her hat, but she wanted to know for herself, and she created a male Twitter account and said some of the same things, exactly the same things on that as she was saying on her own. And some things she said were getting massive piles on it. Of course, it's there's great data behind this. It's nothing that would pass any kind of academic test, but it was just the fact. It was these things that she was saying on her obviously female account, she was being piled on for, and what she was saying on the account that was assumed to be a male, nothing. Absolutely nothing. No one was even commenting. So it's, it is a big job we've got to do, but I do think sea changes in policy and politics can be done with the right will. And, we have a feminist first minister. We do have some really brilliant women in Holyrood, and hopefully more to come to join them. And we have women's groups like Women's Aid, and Zero Tolerance and Gender Friendly, who are not going to stop fighting the good fight, because our daughters can't go through this. There has to be an end.
Yeah, now I'm wondering about all these things that you've been saying, Suzanne and Kirsten. We've got a big job ahead of us. It's something that we're all really committed to. And yet, when I look at the evidence of girls' experience in schools and in education, there's an absolute epidemic of sexual abuse and harassment. And as you say, Suzanne, so much of it is normalised and treated as kind of acceptable behaviour, and really isn't called out because people they think somehow that we live in an equal society because at a formal level or at a legal level, there is some kind of equality enshrined in law. And yet, under that, there's this enormous kind of epidemic or plague of really systemic abuse of women and policing of women's behaviour. I'm just wondering, how do we actually define this? I would like you to think about, do you have a working definition of misogyny? Because maybe if we knew, really what are the roots of this, we could be more effective in tackling it. Kirsten.
Well, a very smart feminist historian told me it goes way back to before BCE. So we've
This
got a
sounds
way
like
back.
It's been
flattery,
around a
Suzanne.
lot, and we don't necessarily need to name it to know exactly what it is. Thousands of women know exactly what it is when it happens to them. But I wanted to pick up on this point and link it to the point you made earlier about legislation, because the Women's Equality Party does have a policy about standalone legislation as misogyny as a hate crime. So not just seeing it as an additional feature to when people experience hate crime, because we've got very good laws about hate crime. And hate crime is about the reason hate crime is worse than just crime against individuals is because it's attacking that whole community as well as attacking the individual. And this is the important thing. We need to start thinking about women as a whole community who are damaged by misogyny. And of course, we know there's lots and lots of evidence that shows that men are damaged by misogyny as well. So that, hatred or fear of women because they are women type misogyny, and that sort of targeting of women, sexualized imagery, sexualized abuse, the use of language that is targeting a woman's sex and gender is very, very clearly, what misogyny is. We all know it. We all experience it. We've all experienced the harassment that is linked to misogyny that is happening to us because we are women, and it's not happening to men because they are men. And so there is something about, and Suzanne is exactly right. The smoking ban is a brilliant example of this, because as a smoker, I felt targeted and I felt, no, nobody's going to do that. And now I'm like really, really guilty whenever I go anywhere near a packet of cigarettes. So what we need to do is get ourselves to a state where men, not just men, but mostly men, feel really, really guilty every time they even think about saying something horrible to a woman because she's a woman. There's a lovely thing about using Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as a standard. So if you would not say it to Dwayne Johnson's face, do not say it to a woman online, in the workplace, on the bus or tram, in a club or anywhere. If you would not say it to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, do not say it to women. And that men understand, because they absolutely understand that Dwayne Johnson is somebody who's got power. So part of it is we need to say, don't do this to women, but we also need to change the debate so that women are seen as people with power, so that men are not so afraid of them getting power. So it's seen as the norm, so they feel less threatened by the idea. But that would follow from a misogyny and anti-misogyny hate crime legislation, because the two things that changing policies or legislation does. One is that it makes the damn thing illegal. So you have things in place. You have, if it's a crime, you get a fine, you get punishment for it. But the second thing, the really, really important thing, is that it sends a message, a very strong message about what is and isn't acceptable behavior. Now, anybody lighting up a cigarette in a pub now will know that is completely and utterly unacceptable. Not just illegal, but unacceptable. It probably won't even need the bartender to come over and say, that's illegal, we're going to call the police, because people around them will stop them doing that kind of thing. We need to take exactly the same approach to misogyny everywhere that we see it, and having it as a hate crime would be a really, really powerful message. And you get a lot of people saying, oh, it's overkill. But even the debate around hate crime, even the debate around what constitutes misogyny would be a really positive move forward, because it would mean that it wouldn't just be women like us having these explicit conversations about misogyny. It would mean the whole country was having a conversation about misogyny. And that's where we need to get to, where everybody sees it as unacceptable. And so that people who are engaging with it and doing it not only learn that it's unacceptable, but they are supported by men around them who will model better behavior. And suddenly it will become not just illegal, but incredibly uncool to be misogynistic. At the moment, it's a groupthink situation. It's incredibly cool amongst some sectors of male society to be misogynistic, to misuse that power and that abuse. And we see very clearly that it goes from online name calling, and it can very, very quickly escalate to, physical violence, actual violence against women and girls. So that's why we need to tackle it, because we need to tackle it at the root. We need to change the way people think about it, and we need to change the way people approach it and talk about it. And honestly, a hate crime legislation would be a really fantastic first start, first step in that direction.
Yeah, and Gender published a really helpful discussion document, I think about this time last year, laying out precisely why that kind of legislation, the standalone, however it's framed, would really start to make a difference, because it's, as you're saying, Kirsten, it's about it's about knowing there are consequences for
Absolutely.
unacceptable behaviour, because so much of this kind of culture is driven by a kind of easy entitlement that people
Absolutely.
are absolutely, you know, these things, you can say them and it'll just be absolutely acceptable.
You can say them because you're entitled to say them, because you're in a space that is yours, it's male space, it's public space.
Yeah.
All of that
And it's
kind of needs to
powerful.
be said. And it's lovely
I
that you brought up in gender, because one of the great things about Scottish policymaking, and also one of the reasons why I'm pro-independence, is that there is much more of a collective approach to policymaking that involves the civic and the third sector and, you know, wider society than there is at the Westminster Parliament. And that's partly because of economies of scale. So you've got an issue, you can get people around the table from the third sector, from different organisations, from different political parties, and really thrash it out, because Scotland is small enough to do that. But it's also about sort of Scottish pride and civic participation. And in a way that was kind of, you know, the Pandora's box was opened around that, around the 2014 independence referendum. Suddenly people's voices counted, and that never went away. So groups like ours, or Women for Independence, and those grassroots groups, need to be doing that in their own situations as well. But the other thing I would really like to see, I would like to see it to be impossible to get elected if you have been publicly a misogynist. I would like to see the civic society voters actually exercising their democratic views at the ballot box, because that will change behaviours amongst political parties quicker than anything else. If they think they're going to lose a seat because they've been a bit of an arse towards women, then that would be absolutely brilliant. So we all need to do that in our own political parties, in our own civic movements. We all need to make sure that we are all doing that we're all calling it out. Yeah. And that there is a threat. You said about consequences. There is no greater consequence for an MSP or an MP or a local councillor than to actually lose their seat and their job because they've been a misogynist. That's what I'd also really like to see happening.
I think you're absolutely right. In the conversation around post all the Salmon trial, and some conversations, uncomfortable conversations that I was forcing myself to have with people in the party and people online, and talking about how, taking aside Mr. Salmon was found not guilty in a court of law, but outside the behaviours, and other men saying, oh, you know, it's similar sort of conversations that we had during the Me Too movement, where the sort of, both of you know exactly what I mean. Oh, you know, when do you know, how do you even get to ask a woman out? When do you know, how do you flirt? Well, men can't tell anymore what's acceptable. This is a nonsense. And a male friend of mine, kind of rough and ready guy that I grew up with, I loved, he said to someone, we were all in a pub talking about politics, and he said, if you are a man, and you can't think whether or not your behaviours, you don't know what your behaviours, whether it's right or proper, or you're moaning about not being allowed to flirt. Now imagine yourself in a prison and you're locked up, and there's a man who's bigger than you. It goes to this Dwayne Johnson allegory as well. If you're in prison and there's a man who's bigger than you and he sits beside you and says, let's go a walk together, or puts his arm around you, and if you can imagine that might make you frightened, then you can imagine how women feel in a workplace. It's about power. I am pleased that there's a bit of a sea change happening to change the subject slightly. My daughter's 15 and a half, and her friends, and there was some talk recently about school uniforms, and I was telling the paper, and the usual with girls being asked to change the clothes they wear or not wear skirts, etc. And my daughter and her friends had been chatting about it, and she they didn't like that narrative at all, that girls should be changing, and and they talked about it with their guidance teacher in school, who's a fabulous young woman. And my daughter came home and I said, well, how did that go? And she said, well, we've decided, Mum, that girls will not be changing our behaviours to stop men hurting us, because if I stay home, or I don't go alone, or I don't wear the special nail varnish, or I have to guard my drink, or I have to make sure I've got money to get a taxi home if I'm older. What am I actually saying here? Am I actually saying rape the other girl, the one who can afford the taxi home or doesn't wear the nail varnish? Boys have to change and men have to change. So I was really encouraged to see that young girls, she's only 15, are saying no, it's boys that are changing. And thankfully, a lot of her friends are, the young boys that she's friends with as well, are taking that view too. So yeah, we've got some young people coming up that are willing to challenge these behaviours. So I think it is the time, and I think the next Holyrood parliamentary term is the time that we have to do it, and that we have to push for the standalone hate legislation. And we have got the women in Scotland to do it. We've got as you say, there's such a, Scotland's small, we can't get the people around the table. There's a little bit of a crossover on boards. We all know each other, and we can get around the table. In the 3 years I was on the Engender board, it was wonderful to see the working together with people, parliamentarians, with people in Equally Safe, with people in Women's 50/50, with Women for Independence, and we all sense check and make sure that we're trying to put policies in place and make policy decisions that are fit for purpose and that have best practice, and put women and girls at the heart of everything we do in Scotland to try and make it better. We have to be pragmatic, but bold ambition and pragmatism are not necessarily unlikely bedfellows. We have to do both. We have to protect women in the now and try and change the laws so that we make them safer in the future.
Thanks very much for that, Suzanne. I think what we're concluding here is that it shouldn't be women's responsibility to take care of our own safety and well-being, whether online or in any other public space or context, and that we really need to challenge this kind of unbridled and unapologetic sexism which still plagues our society and our discourse and our culture. This has been a really interesting discussion. Thanks very much to Suzanne and to Kirsten. We've got a long way to go, but we know how we're on the road and how we're going to get there. So I really hope that this will contribute to an ongoing normalisation of the unacceptability of misogyny and abuse in public life, and that is very much part of gender equality and gender justice for all of us and for the well-being of our whole society and our political life. So thanks very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie.
So we're at the end now of our evening. Thanks very much for watching, and thanks again to Suzanne and to Kirsten for joining us.
Pleasure.
Good evening. Thank you.